I'm going to read an old essay of mine, which was written when I was doing postdoc in Horace Laboratory in Cambridge University in the United Kingdom. The title of the essay is Roger Penrose Visits Cambridge, and it covers the events from the 11th to 12th of January 1997. 11th January 1997. On the eve prior to the talk, I went to the station to pick up Roger Penrose with Ada Pella and Roger Thomas. He came with two large bags. Apparently, he just arrived from the States and has been staying at the Royal Society in London for a couple of days. He had this very fragile, elf-like atmosphere. The three of us introduced ourselves and shook hands. It had snowed earlier that day, and the air was very cold. We got in the car. Roger Penrose began to explain that he had a bad flu in the States, and one of his eardrums was damaged, so he had some difficulty in listening. We arrived at the restaurant on 2022 Chester Road. It was a nice, cozy restaurant with a special private room upstairs. The other guests were already there in the room. John Moran, who suggested this restaurant to Adele, said proudly that it was almost like dining in one's old house. Horace Barrow, his wife Miranda, and Graham Mitchell stood up to welcome Penrose. It appeared that they knew each other well. So the meals began to arrive, and I sat at the opposite side of the table with Adele and listened to what these old men would discuss. They talked about scuba diving in Australia, how to publish a successful book, etc., etc. Penrose explained to us about an episode when he appeared in the film A Brief History of Time. The Hollywood guys came down to Penrose's room in Oxford and said they would make a mock-up of his office in the studio and made notes, measurements, etc. When Penrose went down to the studio, he found this monster of an office. They had installed a huge leather chair and one huge desk before it, clean with no papers scattered over it. And they have stacked the bookshelves with the antique books which had nothing to do with Penrose's work. When Penrose sat in the chair, he found that he could not reach the desk. So he tried to pull the chair closer, only to find that it was nailed to the floor. Penrose complained, and there came a bunch of guys who denailed, moved, and re-nailed the chair. The whole business was incredibly expensive and stupid. Then they asked Penrose, when does time flow backwards? Referring to Stephen Hawking's idea that when the universe begins to contract, the time would flow backwards. Penrose answered, I think that time would not flow backwards under any circumstances. They said, cut. No, you can't say that. Please imagine some situation where the time flows backwards. Then Penrose says, I just can't imagine any circumstances under which the time begins to flow backwards. Cut. No, we can't take this. Please think of some extreme situation where the time would flow backwards. So finally, Penrose was forced to say something incredibly contrived, something he never intended to say. When Penrose began to talk, he looked much younger and vivacious. Then Graham Mitchell said to Penrose that maybe he should show the Greeks the Penrose styling and went on to ask if he would be able to produce them. Penrose briefly said yes. I asked he was writing a third book after Emperor's New Mind and Shadows of the Mind. He said yes, and then he said the book titled The Large and Small in the Mind is coming out in February, to be published from Vintage, Random House. Apparently, it is a book about physics in which he pours out his opinions about other people's theories, so it should be very interesting. Penrose and Stephen Hawking made some nasty remarks at the end of the book. I asked if he had written about superstrings. Penrose's eyes twinkled. Yes, that is obviously something I should write, isn't it? But as far as I understand, the superstring theory is gone, and now they are talking about the M theory. M supposedly stands for mysterious or mother or whatever. The great merit of the superstring theory, they said, was that the theory was unique. But now they have several different superstring theories. The uniqueness is gone. But they start talking about membranes. Graham, Graham says, does Ed Wheaton still say that superstring is the theory of the 21st century? Penrose said, yes, I think it is still in the air. Penrose looks at the watch. But the 21st century is just around the corner. I think they should hurry. Well, the dinner was over, and the evening ended prematurely. I took Penrose to St. John's College in Adele's car. The drive was a few minutes. Penrose sits in the front seat, I in the back. I begin to pour out. I think you should be able to derive the whole quantum mechanics from your twistor formalism. Don't you agree? Well, there are these long-term dreams that you cannot work out right away. I still think quantum mechanics is incomplete. I noticed that you draw all the illustrations in your book. In Shadows of the Mind, there is one particularly elaborate drawing about the evolution merit of the consciousness. A man is drawing some geometrical figures on the ground, while the tiger is about to jump onto him. Yes, there is a joke in that drawing, which nobody has noticed. It is the theorem that the guy is trying to prove. By this time, we are in St. John's College, and we are walking towards Penrose's room. Have you come up with a three-dimensional version of your tiling? Yes, not me, but somebody has thought of it. How many pieces do you need? 4. In fact, there is a non-periodic tiling with just one piece. But this is not very interesting. It just spirals out from a point. Or like the one you have in Emperor's New Mind. But that is two-dimensional, of course. It is not difficult to explain this to you. Suppose there is a... I cannot catch the word. Then you add a roof to it. The angle is irrational number, but this is cheating, really. There is no quasi-translational invariance in that case. No. You give this example of non-computational dynamical evolution, which is defined using the halting of Turing machines. Suppose you have a particular series of evolution in discrete time. Surely there is at least one algorithm that produces the same result? Yes, you always have to think of a class of problems, you see. If you consider only one particular example, you can always do it computationally. I won't ask him if that class should have Aleph1, but we are approaching his room now. That particular example of non-computational process is a non-implementable one, isn't it? Do you think you can ever come up with an implementable version of non-computational process? Penrose says something like, but we are in front of his room. So I and Adele said good night to Penrose. He looked very, very tired by them. Maybe the trip to the States and the flu taxed him. So that was day one of my first encounter with Penrose. The clock was 11:30 p.m. On the way back to home, Adele said he liked Penrose. 12th January 1997. On Friday, I went to pick up Penrose in St. John's College. We went up the spiraling stairs of the tower and knocked the door of the senior guest room. 1. There was no answer, and Ada had to knock on the door again and again. A few minutes later, we heard some noise. Penrose opened the door, and we walked in. I saw several transparencies scattered over the table by the window. Some color pens were laid down near the chair. Penrose began to pack his things and told us about a time when he stayed in the same room. While he was working at the desk, he saw a helicopter land on the greens in front of the building. Several police cars rushed to the scene. It was Princess Anne visiting Trinity College. Penrose asked me if I have come across a hard copy of the Psyche D paper. He said that David Chalmers was the guy who originally induced him to write for Psyche D on 2 conditions, namely that the number of commentators should be less than 10, and that a physical copy should be eventually produced. Penrose asked David Chalmers if the copy was available, and he said yes, but so far he has failed to send any. Penrose then said the last time he was there, a swarm of ladybirds invaded the room overnight. Ada said there was something about the color of the ladybirds that makes you avoid harming it. I said that ladybirds are supposed to taste nasty anyway, and added, not that I tried it. Penrose joked that he supposed that ladybirds were not considered as delicacies in Japan. I said no. As we walked towards the Bridge of Sighs, St. John built the bridge imitating the famous one in Venice. I began the questions. If you take any particular result of a non-computational process, you can always simulate it by a computational process. You said yesterday that you have to consider a class of problems to make a distinction between computational and non-computational processes. Is it the case that class must be Aleph1? No, that is not necessary. You see, I understand the argument about computability is always within the bounds of countable infinity. When you consider only countable infinity, within that there is a special class of recursive functions that is computable. That was as far as we got when we came to the portal, and Penrose returned the key. We got on the car. Ada began to ask if he could use Penrose styling for his home. We parked the car in front of the Kenneth Craig building, and we walked up to Horace Barlow Laboratory. I asked Penrose if he knew Horace Barlow before last night, and he answered that he had actually known Horace for a long time. Adele took Penrose into his office to settle the travel fare compensation, etc. Penrose asked for a copy of Shadows of Mine and began to prepare for the talk. I went to my Mac and checked the mails. Some minutes later, I went up to him and gave him a non-periodic tiling handkerchief that I got when I was in Riken from the quartz crystal laboratory. Penrose was delighted. The tiling had hexagonal symmetry with two elementary pieces. It was not Penrose tiling, which was pentagonal symmetry. He said it was by a man named Amal something and was fascinated by the handkerchief. He went on to say that some people confuse tiling by other people with Penrose tiling. In fact, Penrose tiling was sometimes used as a generic name for the whole class of non-periodic tiling. He asked me if I could really spare it, and he was genuinely glad to have the handkerchief. He and Amar was an unlucky man, he already deceased. He said Amar something was an unlucky man, already deceased, who never had any real job. Then he babbled on about non-periodic tiling with 12-fold symmetry, etc. It was a topic he loved. Ada and Penrose went to the tea room. I joined them with my own office cap with the photos of Hara Setsuko on it. When I walked in, I found Graham Mitson already sitting in front of Penrose. Horace Barlow was there. A few minutes later, Andrew Huxley, who formulated the so-called Hodgkin-Huxley equation, which describes the action potential in neurons and was awarded Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine, walked in, and Horace stood up and introduced Penrose to Huxley. Huxley is some 10 years senior to Penrose. Later, Adele told me that Huxley did not know Penrose and said, "You are the son of Penrose, aren't you?" Huxley only recognized him as the son of his father. There was some humor in it when you consider two men of age 66 and 76 talking to each other like that. Graham Mitson was still talking about how to demonstrate your intellectual superiority to when you travel back to ancient Greek. I talked with Horace about his forthcoming trip to Australia. The lecture began at 1 p.m. Most of the stuff I knew very well from reading Emperor and Shadows twice each, so I just paid attention to Roger Penrose himself. He used two projectors. He began the lecture with the transparency of three spheres figure showing the relation between the physical, mental, the Platonic and Platonic worlds. I thought to myself, maybe that was the figure which would represent 100 years from now the whole history of philosophy of Roger Penrose. Then he went on to argue about the non-computational nature of our intelligence. Intelligence needs understanding, and understanding needs awareness. All the transparencies were handwritten with color pens. I found out that actually he was very fond of colors. Earlier, Penrose gave a direction to Adapera in which color he should paint the three spheres representing the three worlds in the poster announcing his talk. For some unknown reason, Penrose thinks that the colors of the physical, mental, and Platonic worlds were blue, red, yellow, respectively. I actually asked Penrose why he chose these particular colors as we walked up to the Horace Barlow Laboratory. He had no idea. After the lecture, there were three mediocre questions. Adar had to cut it short, as Penrose had already talked for 70 minutes, whereas he was supposed to stop after 1 hour. We went to the reception room. There I found Srimant and Adam. Adam is an earnest Part 2 student who is doing some project with Srimant. Adam asked me what he should read to study computational neuroscience, and I suggested the book by Senovsky. Penrose was surrounded by several eager youth. Horace told me that he liked the lecture and said it is possible that Penrose was right. He said Penrose was an awfully clever and charming fellow, but for himself he is happy to live with the conventional classical physics. Penrose wanted to catch the 3 p.m. bus to Oxford, so I and Adele whisked him out of the reception. As we went down the stairs, Graham Mitson catches Penrose. Roger, you should come to my dinner party. I have these wonderful dinner parties. As we walked to the car, I asked Penrose the most important question. I think you would rather think that the quantum direction process is deterministic. Yes, that is right, although there is some complication about the influence of the environment, which makes the dynamics random. If you have an isolated system, and then the system reduces itself on its own, that reaction would be deterministic, wouldn't it? Yes, I cannot say I am certain, but I would rather prefer it to be that way. 10 minutes later, we saw Penrose off at the bus station. As we were standing in a queue, Penrose suddenly turned back to me and said if I had any question to ask him, I was welcome. I thanked him, and just then the driver was ready to sell him a ticket. I noticed that the weather was getting mild. So this is my essay. I wrote back in 1997, and reading it does bring back many warm memories. And if you want to read it by text, please search for Korea Journal, Kenmogi, and the title of the essay is Roger Penrose Visits Cambridge. So I was really thrilled when Roger Penrose received a Nobel Prize for Physics, and I really respect Roger Penrose, and I believe that many intuitions that he has about quantum mechanics and space and time and consciousness are correct. And you know, the hope is maybe somebody, it might be Roger Penrose or somebody else, or maybe me, would be able to come up with some rather nice model about all these things. And reading this essay makes me feel that I should, be striving more and be thinking deeper and be a good person, because Roger Penrose is such a really wonderful good person. And it's really sad to remember that my mentor, a really wonderful friend, Horace Barrow, is not anymore. And, I miss him. And also, I miss Graham Mitson. He was a really nice person. And, time passes and people go, but memories remain. And this reading of this essay has been an attempt to revive that memory for just a brief period of time. So, and by the way, this is a model for butterfly, and for me, somehow, this seems to represent the Platonic world that Roger Penrose refers to. So, I put it here.